How can free will exist as a meaningful concept if God tinkers with Pharaoh's heart? Are our own choices out of our control? Is God unfair to Pharaoh? One of the major showdowns in the Christian story takes place in Exodus, where God confronts the Egyptian Pharaoh in a bid to liberate Israel from brutal slavery. Pharaoh continually rejects God's pleas through Moses, judicially resulting in a series of escalating plagues that strike Egypt. Now, a strange feature of these encounters, though, is that a spotlight is placed on the state of Pharaoh's heart, with both Pharaoh and God identified at different times as the one to make it hard. And this hardening of Pharaoh's heart raises serious questions, both from Christianity's critics and from curious Christians. How can free will exist as a meaningful concept if God tinkers with Pharaoh's heart? Are our own choices out of our control? And how can it be justice if God hardens Pharaoh's heart and then punishes him for not letting Israel go? So how does the Christian story make sense of what's happening in the Exodus story? Why did God harden Pharaoh's heart? Well, let me start by getting a few observations out onto the table before we try and reason upwards to any serious conclusions. First, Pharaoh's heart was never particularly soft towards either God or humanity anywhere in the Exodus story. In chapter 1, we're introduced to a new Pharaoh who didn't much care about Joseph's saving role in Egypt's past, nor about God's people in the present, Israel. No, he enslaved them, forcing them under brutal conditions to make bricks in order to build two new cities, Pithom and Ramses, which coincidentally help us to date the events in Exodus. So this Pharaoh is not exactly a stand-up guy, not to say anything about the way he tried to control the slave population by murdering newborn boys. And although Pharaoh dies after Moses flees to Midian in chapter 2, it's safe to say his successor, potentially Ramses II from the New Kingdom era in Egypt's history, inherited his father's brutality. The first time this new Pharaoh's heart is mentioned comes in chapter 3, where God says it's already so hard that Pharaoh will need to be compelled by force to release Israel from slavery. Then the first time Moses asks Pharaoh to let God's people go, not only does Pharaoh refuse, but he doubles down on his father's exacting demands on the Israelite slaves, forcing them to work 7 days, no longer providing the straw for bricks, and then punishing any drop in productivity. So whatever we make of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart in the story to come, it's not like he was predisposed towards obeying God's just cry for freedom in the first place. Second, Exodus is a special case in the Christian story. And plenty of the events in Israel's story involve dynamics that are unique to that situation. For instance, Israel was never to be a conquering nation, but only a defensive one, forbidden from going off to war simply to expand their own borders. Except, of course, in the unique situation of the Canaanite conquest in the first place, where God's commands to drive out the 7 nations before them was a judicial act fitting a specific moment in history. So even if God did judicially harden Pharaoh's heart for the sake of the story, to set up the paradigm of God's power to liberate humanity from evil, you might say, it simply doesn't follow that this is God's normal MO. And third, Scripture is relatively ambiguous about what happened exactly in these encounters. See, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is mentioned 16 times across the Exodus story. 4 times, God describes to Moses and Aaron what will happen in the future, saying, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." Another 4 times, including the first 2 times any hardening actually happens in the story, Scripture uses the passive indicator that Pharaoh's heart became hard, without saying by who. 2 times, both in chapter 8, the story says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And then 6 times, all towards the end of the story from chapter 9 onwards, Scripture says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But what does this description of hardening mean? Does Pharaoh drink a tall cup of concrete to strengthen his own resolve? Does God actively tinker with Pharaoh's motivations to change what he would have otherwise done? Or is the hardening some kind of poetic way of speaking about giving someone over to their desires? Well, Scripture is ambiguous. See, the simple truth is Christians have options in how to make sense of Pharaoh's hardening. Given the complex interplay between God's sovereign actions in Scripture and our human responsibility on the table in this story, this is one of those places where Christians don't agree on what mechanism is being described. Depending on the theological grid you bring to the text, you'll draw different conclusions. Some Christians are entirely comfortable with the notion that God actively tinkers with the state of Pharaoh's heart, making him reject Moses' plea when, if he was left to his own agency, he may have otherwise relented. Those who hold this position will point to scriptures that speak of God directing the waters of a man's heart, or that emphasize God's sovereign right to do what he wants. They may isolate the Exodus story as a unique case of judicial hardening so that God's glory is on display, or they might say that this is simply the case for everything across both Old and New Testaments, with God hardening or softening those whom he will according to his purposes. In other words, they lean into God's sovereignty. Other Christians want to avoid the charges that God is either here subverting human agency or being unfair to Pharaoh by suggesting that Pharaoh's heart becoming hard is simply God giving Pharaoh over to his natural inclinations. See, they'll emphasize passages like Romans 1, where God gives sinful humanity over to their desires as an act of judgment. And they'll lean to human responsibility here, saying God is simply permitting Pharaoh to harden his own heart without actively intervening to stay Pharaoh's hand. One third way to resolve all these tensions, though, and the one that makes the most sense to me personally, is to appeal to the Molinist interpretation. See, this view says that through middle knowledge, God already knows how Pharaoh would freely respond to Moses' repeated pleas, namely by hardening his own heart. So by Moses being sent by God to bring the revelation of his will that Israel be released, God is, in a sense, architecting how these events play out. Of course, God isn't tinkering with Pharaoh's desires by subverting human agency, but through providence, seeing when and how to intervene through divine revelation, God is simply directing Pharaoh's own free choices towards God's ultimate ends. To me, this strong view of God's sovereignty, expressed through divine providence, while still upholding libertarian human agency and moral responsibility, this makes the best sense of the biblical data on hand, and avoids any notion of God being unfair in his treatment towards Pharaoh in the Exodus story.
Dan here from Questioning Christianity. Thanks so much for checking us out. We are all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So if you're enjoying the content, make sure you subscribe and click the bell on YouTube, and then go ahead and follow us on socials.